Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are opening up a truly classic piece of literature. We're going to take a really detailed look at Khushwant Singh's autobiographical chapter, The Portrait of a Lady. And we are going to look at every little detail of this story today. It is not just a simple character sketch, It's this incredibly profound exploration of a shifting relationship between a grandson and his grandmother, all set against a backdrop of changing times and environments. We're going to trace the intricate details of their bond, her unyielding religious devotion, and how her quiet life of routine builds up to an absolutely breathtaking, silent farewell. So, to really get this story, we have to start by seeing the grandmother exactly how the author saw her. For 20 years, she had been old and wrinkled. So terribly old that the young Khushwant Singh actually found it almost revolting to even imagine she had ever been young and pretty or, played games as a child. But what's truly captivating here is his description of her. She wasn't conventionally pretty, but to him, she was profoundly beautiful. She'd hobble about the house in these spotless white clothes. She'd have one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other was just constantly telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over a pale, puckered face, and her lips were always moving in an audible prayer. It gave her this aura of deep, unwavering peace. It's like she was an expanse of pure white serenity, just breathing peace and contentment. Now, just to give you a bit of contrast, the author also tells us about his grandfather's portrait, which hung right above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. This guy wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes, and he had this long, white beard that covered the best part of his chest. Singh actually notes, with a bit of that classic childhood humor, that his grandfather looked at least 100 years old. He didn't look like the sort of guy who would just have a wife or a few kids. No, he looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. It perfectly captures how, to a kid, grandparents just seem entirely eternal, right? Like they're frozen in this state of ancient, revered seniority. To really grasp how this relationship develops over the years, we're going to look at three distinct phases of their lives, basically tracking how their changing environments shaped their bond. First up, we have their childhood village life, then boyhood and the big city turning point, and finally, young adulthood at university and beyond. All right, let's start with phase one, village life. When the author's parents went off to live in the city, they left him behind with his grandmother, which basically made them constant companions. And their daily morning routine, it was incredibly intimate. She would wake him up and get him ready for school, all while reciting her morning prayer in this monotonous sing-song voice. She did this hoping he'd learn it by heart, though he totally admits he only listened because he loved her voice and never actually bothered to memorize a single word. Then she'd fetch his wooden slate, which was already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, bundle it up with a tiny earthen ink pot and a red pen, and hand the whole shebang to him. Before heading out, they'd share a breakfast of thick, stale chapatis spread with just a little butter and sugar. You can see how her intense religious devotion was just seamlessly woven into every single thing she did to care for him. This beautifully illustrates how their village life was so much more than just a living arrangement. It was a deeply shared spiritual experience. She always went to school with him, and the reason is pretty fascinating. The school was actually attached to the temple. While the priest taught the kids the alphabet and morning prayers out on the veranda, the grandmother would sit inside the temple just quietly reading the scriptures. Once they were both done, they'd walk back home together. But they were never alone on this walk. The village dogs would literally wait for them at the temple door. These dogs would follow them all the way home, growling and fighting with each other over the extra stale chapatis the grandmother purposely carried just to feed them. It was this incredible life of harmony, routine, and mutual companionship. But, as you might guess, everything shifts when the author's parents finally get comfortably settled in the city and send for them. As Singh bluntly puts it, that was a turning point in our friendship. Now, what's really crucial to understand here is that they were actually still sharing the exact same room in this new city house. But being in the same physical space, it didn't stop them from emotionally starting to drift apart. The environment had entirely shifted, and you can see the foundation of their daily bond starting to crack. To understand why this rift even happened, we've got to look at the two different schools. Back in the village, education was tied directly to the temple, prayers and scriptures, all things the grandmother deeply valued and understood. But here in the city, the author started going to an English school. He traveled by motor bus, which meant she couldn't walk with him anymore. There were no street dogs for her to feed. And when he came home talking about what he was learning, things like English words, Western science, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the fact that the world is round, well, she was just completely lost. This is such a critical moment because this secular, modern schooling caused his devout grandmother immense, quiet anguish.
She was genuinely distressed that the English school didn't teach anything about God or the scriptures. Since she didn't believe in the things they were teaching, she couldn't help him with his lessons anymore, which completely broke a major link in their daily routine. But the real breaking point? That came when he announced he was being given music lessons. To her traditional mindset, music had these very lewd associations. She literally thought it was the monopoly of harlots and beggars, totally unfit for gentlefolk. But she didn't yell, she didn't scold him. Instead, she expressed her intense disapproval through absolute silence. And after that day, they rarely talked.
As the years rolled by, the gap just widened. And that brings us to the final phase of their separation. When the author goes up to university, he is finally given a room of his own. The text painfully points out that the, quote, common link of friendship was snapped. And the grandmother, she didn't fight it. She just accepted her seclusion with quiet resignation. That shared space that had kept them physically tethered was gone, so she retreated even further into her own internal spiritual world. Left entirely to her own devices, she adapted to this new isolation by setting up a very rigorous new routine. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her spinning wheel. She almost never left it to talk to anyone, and her lips were constantly moving in her quiet, relentless prayers. But she did find one outlet for that caregiving energy she used to lavish on her grandson and the village dogs. For just a half hour in the afternoon, she would relax and shift her focus to a brand new group of animals in the city courtyard. And let me tell you, this half hour was pure chaotic joy. She would sit out on the veranda, breaking bread into little bits, and hundreds of little sparrows would flock around her. The text describes it as creating a veritable bedlam of chirpings. It paints such a vivid, wonderful picture. Some birds would perch on her legs, some on her shoulders, and some would even brazenly sit right on top of her head. She just smiled and never shooed a single one away. Out of a long day filled with silent spinning and praying, this noisy, chaotic gathering of birds used to be the absolute happiest half hour of her day. The ultimate test of their emotional distance happens when the author decides to go abroad for 5 years for further studies. He was absolutely sure she would be upset. I mean, at her age, you could never really tell if they would ever see each other again. But she wasn't sentimental at all. She came to the railway station to see him off, but didn't say a word or show any dramatic emotion. Her mind was just entirely lost in prayer, her fingers busy telling the beads of her rosary. In this deeply poignant, stoic moment, she simply, silently kissed his forehead. As he left, he cherished that moist imprint, truly believing it might be the very last sign of physical contact between them.
But incredibly, that wasn't the case. 5 years later, he returns home. And who is waiting for him at the station? His grandmother. And she didn't look a single day older. She still had no time for words. As she clasped him in her arms, he could just hear her quietly reciting those same prayers. Even on the very first day of his highly anticipated return, her routine was ironclad. Her happiest moments were still spent out in the courtyard, feeding her beloved sparrows for even longer than usual, playfully scolding them with what the author calls frivolous rebukes. She was an absolute anchor of consistency in his life. But then, on the evening of his return, something completely unprecedented happens. Think about this for a second. What could possibly cause a woman whose entire existence is defined by constant, unbroken prayer to just stop praying for the very first time? The answer is a shocking, explosive celebration of her grandson coming home. Abandoning her quiet rosary, she actually went out and collected the women of the neighborhood. She procured this old, dilapidated drum with sagging skins. And for several hours, this frail old woman passionately thumped that drum, singing loudly about the homecoming of warriors. Her family literally had to step in and persuade her to stop, just so she wouldn't overstrain herself. It was this massive, exhausting outpouring of all the emotion she had kept completely hidden at the railway station 5 years prior. And, as the author notes, it was the very first time since he had known her that she did not pray. Well, the physical toll of all that celebrating was immediate. The very next morning, she was taken ill with a mild fever. Now, the doctor assured the family it would pass, but the grandmother interpreted her illness very differently. She calmly declared to them that her end was near. In her mind, the fact that she had omitted her prayers just a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life was a deeply serious matter. So she absolutely refused to waste a single second of her precious remaining time talking to her family. Despite all their protests, she just ignored them. She lay peacefully in her bed, instantly returning to her core essence, praying and telling her beads. And the transition is just incredibly sudden and gentle. Even before the family could suspect a thing, her lips stopped moving, and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread across her wrinkled face, and they knew she was gone. She departed exactly as she had lived, quietly and steeped in an expanse of pure white serenity.
Now, let's set the scene for the final, most poignant moment of this whole explainer. Following custom, she was lifted off the bed, laid on the ground, and covered with a red shroud. Later in the evening, as they went to her room with a crude stretcher to take her to be cremated, the setting sun had actually lit her room and the veranda with a blaze of golden light. It is this beautifully stark cinematic image, right? The quiet courtyard, the golden sunset, the red shroud. But as the family stopped halfway in the courtyard, they witnessed something completely extraordinary. All over the veranda, right up to where she lay wrapped in that shroud, thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. But that bedlam of chirrupings from her happy half-hours, it was completely gone. There was absolutely no chirruping, just a heavy, complete silence. Feeling sorry for the birds, the author's mother fetched some bread, broke it into little crumbs exactly the way the grandmother used to, and threw it to them. But the sparrows took absolutely no notice of the bread. They weren't there for the food. When the family finally carried the grandmother's corpse away, those thousands of birds simply flew off quietly. The next morning, the sweeper just swept the untouched breadcrumbs right into the dustbin. It is a breathtaking, silent tribute, and it leaves us with this final, really powerful thought to ponder. If animals, who operate purely on instinct, can so profoundly speak the universal language of grief, literally ignoring the food they usually fought over just to mourn a friend, what does that tell us about the impact of a quiet, devoted life? Khushwant Singh's grandmother wasn't some historical titan or a famous scholar. She was simply an old woman with a spinning wheel, a rosary, and a pocket full of stale bread. Yet her steady, peaceful presence commanded the silent respect of thousands. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. I really hope this deep dive leaves you with a newfound appreciation for the quiet, steady figures in your own life. Catch you next time.